right, hi everybody. I'm Alice Marwick. I've been a fellow here for the last year, and I came in planning on working on my next book about privacy. And I ended up spending the year not doing that at all, and instead working on a completely different project, somewhat inspired by the results of the 2016 election. And I've been joined on this by a wonderful team here at DNS, and I want to present sort of the top-level findings from a very large report that we put out about a month ago about media manipulation and disinformation online. So you may remember, or you may not, that in October, there you go. So you may remember that in October of last year, 4 Chicago teenagers kidnapped a developmentally disabled man and tortured him on Facebook Live. And it was a really big story for a week or two. And this is Mike Cernovich. Cernovich is an alt-right media personality, and he has a very large, engaged audience, and he uses emerging technologies to communicate with them. So he used Periscope, which is Twitter's streaming product, to communicate with his audience and figure out how they could use all the publicity around this event to their advantage. So they came up with a particular hashtag BLM kidnapping, and decided they were going to try and link the kidnappers with the Black Lives Matter movement, which alt-right is generally not a fan of. They're not really big into racial justice. So here's one of his tweets. If Trump must disavow every random internet troll, then Black Lives Matter must disavow every crime or else they support it. So using an army of coordinated Twitter accounts and bots, Cernovich and his supporters got the hashtag to tweet 480,000 times in 24 hours. It trended across the United States and became so prominent that every mainstream media story about the kidnapping after that had to disclaim the fact that the kidnappers were not, in fact, part of Black Lives Matter. Now, why is this important? It's important because Cernovich and his audience know that messaging is reinforced through repetition. They don't care if the mainstream media is disclaiming these stories. They just want them to be repeated. For people like Cernovich and his ilk, who are part of a new populist movement that's very much rooted in white supremacy, misogyny, and anti-Semitism, they know that even if 99 out of 100 people disagree with their message, the mainstream media is able to get that message out to the 1% of people who might agree with them that they can't otherwise reach. So what we've been doing for the last 6 to 8 months is laying out how these far-right subcultures use social media to manipulate the mainstream media into spreading and amplifying their frames for news. So I'm going to show you a diagram that I've sort of been working on for the last month that is how media manipulation works. And it kind of works like a chain. So on the top left-hand corner, you can see spaces that are set up for what we would call far-right organizing. So there's the image boards 4chan and 8chan, which some of you may be familiar with. They're sort of centers of far-right trolling. There's what's called alt-tech, which are alt-right spaces that are set up when the far-right gets kicked off of mainstream spaces. So gab.ai is far-right Twitter. Vote is far-right Reddit. They also have a far-right Wikipedia and a far-right GoFundMe. Discord is a gamer chat space that is very easily, it's like Slack, and it's really easy to set up, so they use it to sort of do different campaigns around agile issues. And finally, they have their own blogs and podcasts. So in these organizing spaces, they come up with hashtags, they brainstorm news frames, they think about publicity strategies, and they think about how to recruit new people. They then use mainstream media, social media sites to get these messages out. So Twitter is the primary one. They use hashtags to try to influence like mainstream media news frames, because often journalists source news stories from Twitter. They use Reddit and Facebook groups to get their messages into more mainstream conservative groups. And they tend to use YouTube to make these like conspiracy theory videos that are about like the real truth about like the Illuminati and the Clintons or whatever. Okay, so I want today really briefly to talk about a few of the tactics and strategies that we've noted that the far right uses. And what's important to understand is that they are aware of a number of vulnerabilities in the mainstream media, a predilection to sensationalism and novelty, a reliance on clickbait and metrics, and a immense amount of time pressure to pump out a lot of stories in a short period of time. So these are all things that the far right uses to their advantage. And I just want to point out that when we use the term far right, we're talking about something different than the alt-right. The far right is really a weird amalgam of people like white supremacists, men's rights activists, but also conspiracy theorists and trolls. It's sort of like an unholy alliance of people who come together online to work for different causes and ideologies. So the first thing they use is novelty and sensationalism because the media loves to report on things that are new. And one of the reasons we don't generally use the term alt-right is because the term alt-right itself plays on the media's predilection for novelty. You generally don't see KKK members on the Sunday talk shows, for example. But once Richard Spencer, who's a leader of the alt-right, coined the term, he started popping up on mainstream media sources talking about this new thing called the alt-right. Even though the alt-right's ideas, everything from isolationism to anti-Semitism, are very well-worn, familiar paths in American history. So spokespeople like Richard Spencer, they're very telegenic, they're very media friendly, and they do stuff like appear on CNN. So here's the chyron that CNN put after having Richard Spencer on. Alt-right founder questions if Jews are people. Not typically something you would see in mainstream media discourse. So their goal here is what they call opening the Overton window. And the Overton window is the range of ideas that are acceptable in mainstream political discourse. And it generally kind of goes from like center left to center right. You don't tend to see a lot of like anarchists or lesbian separatists in like mainstream political discourse, but the far right has been able to kind of shift that rightward. Another example is from this guy named Weave, Andrew Orenheimer, who's a notorious troll and hacker, and he's also kind of a master media manipulator. And recently he did this hack last year where he exploited a security vulnerability in a bunch of internet-connected printers that were on well-known college campuses, and he sent a bunch of super racist, anti-Semitic flyers to be printed out from these printers. Now, basically, probably a couple of hundred people saw it. It was not actually thousands of printers. It was like a couple hundred. Probably the actual impact of people who saw these flyers was a fairly small amount. But because Weave is already a sort of noted media personality, and because it had this hook and novelty of like a security flaw in the Internet of Things, it got picked up and widely spread. So here's a story from Motherboard where it says, the latest exploit of notorious hacker Weave shows just how awful the Internet of Things can be. And he's really good at using this kind of predilection for novelty and sensationalism to spread his message. All right, so the second strategy we've identified is ambiguity. Now, this is Milo Yiannopoulos, who you may also have heard of, who is until fairly recently, another leader in the alt-right. And Milo is gay and has a Jewish father, and he claims that the alt-right only uses Nazi imagery to be ironic, in much the same way that 80s heavy metal bands used satanic imagery to kind of annoy their elders and, provoke conversation. Now, this is reinforced by outlets like Breitbart, which are called alt-light, meaning they repeat some of the talking points of the far right, but they don't tend to repeat the more extreme forms of racism or anti-Semitism that you find rife in far right spaces. So there's plenty of people who will claim that the use of racist or sexist or Nazi imagery is just trolling. They're trying to push buttons. But actually, this ambiguity works as a cloak for real white supremacists like Weave. And using Nazi symbols, racist words, and spreading racist ideology supports white supremacy, regardless if you're doing it ironically or not. And so the ambiguity of the alt-right allows people to disassociate themselves with parts of the movement they find distasteful, while still being able to sort of partner with people on causes that they support. Another strategy is participation and collaboration. As we got more into these worlds, we realized that many of the techniques that are used look really familiar to us from other internet spaces. So this is a screenshot from 8chan before the French election. And we had documented, and other people have documented as well, the fact that 8chan was very invested in Marine Le Pen winning the French election. And they tried very hard to spread a variety of anti-Macron messaging across the media landscape. Sorry, wrong clicker again. So here's a sentence. Create anti-Macron and pro-Le Pen memes trying to show how he is actually an establishment plant to the Frenchies who might think he is actually an outsider. Here we will deposit it all and discuss on what best narrative to push forward to the Frenchies. So in places like 8chan, they discuss strategy. They even do like A/B testing at times. They'll throw a lot of different things up against the wall and see what sticks. They'll disseminate certain memes to like Reddit and Facebook and Twitter to see what propagates and what doesn't. And in many ways, this very much resembles what Henry Jenkins calls participatory or collaborative culture. It's a pretty low barrier to entry. Like a lot of the images you see in these spaces are like crappy Microsoft paint art, so pretty much anyone can participate. You have to post an image in order to post on 8chan or 4chan, and there's a lot of different ways that people can participate in the community. So in many ways, it's similar to the dynamics we see on other sites like Wikipedia. It's just they're working towards an end that many of us might find distasteful. The last strategy I want to talk about is radicalization. So the alt-right is, as I said before, is sort of focused on getting more people involved in their cause. And a lot of this is because they are ideologically motivated and they believe that the left has won the culture war. But the process of radicalization is what they call red-pilling the normies. And red-pilling comes from The Matrix. There's a scene where Neo's mentor Morpheus gives him the choice of the red pill and the blue pill. And if he takes the blue pill, he goes back to his cubicle life. And if he takes the red pill, the reality of the Matrix is revealed to him. So they say that being red-pilled is when you open your eyes to the reality of like the Illuminati controlling the world, or there being intense sexism against men, or there being like white genocide. There's like a whole variety of different things you can be red-pilled towards. But the way that people are red-pilled in these communities is often through like the normative use of racist language or shocking or edgy imagery, and often through memes. So in the same places that you'll see a lot of like really hyper-racist memes or very anti-Semitic memes, you'll also see this, which is a pretty mainstream conservative meme. Like it is transphobic and obnoxious, but it is much more mild than many of the other things. And so these types of memes sort of function as a gateway into the more extreme ideologies espoused by the far right. Sorry, this is like the 6th time I've done that and gone backwards. So let's look at what type of effects this type of spreading of far-right messaging has. The first set of effects we've identified is agenda setting and framing with regard to the mainstream media. Again, it doesn't matter if the media debunks or dismisses these messages. What matters is coverage. The amount of media coverage affects what people think is important. This is called agenda setting. The media doesn't tell people what to think, but it helps guide them as to what to think about. Media manipulators in this way are able to influence the public agenda. They also spread misinformation because their goal is to define and frame a news story from the beginning. Research shows that when people are presented with information that contradicts their pre-existing beliefs, they'll often double down on their original opinions rather than changing them. So genuinely correcting misinformation is very difficult once a particular news frame is already out there in the public eye. And an accurate version of events is often less interesting than a sensationalized or simplistic one. So the original framing of the story, the one that's crafted by the media manipulators, is often the one that sticks. We already are at historically low levels of trust in the mainstream media, and unfortunately, this distrust is self-perpetuating. This is partly because groups that are already cynical of the mainstream media, like ideologues or trolls or conspiracy theorists, are often the ones who are drawn to manipulating it. And the more successful they are, the more they believe the media is able to be manipulated, and it decreases their trust in the media further. And the impacts of these mistrusts, unfortunately, are quite significant. People are less likely to access accurate information, which has civic ramifications. It increases voting strictly across partisan lines. It weakens citizens' political knowledge, and it decreases the watchdog function of the mainstream media. And finally, we are worried about this increased radicalization because we're seeing these far-right ideologies spread across new spaces like genre fandom or video gaming, for example. And there's a worrisome rise in violent attacks and extremism from the far-right as a result. So we think that that really needs to be kept an eye on. So in conclusion, social media does enable participation and creativity and organizing, but that's not always done by groups that we might agree with. We can't categorize creative participation as by definition positive. And more specifically, we can't let the far right cloak their messaging in this idea of ambiguity or trolling or irony. Instead, we really need to continue to call out sexism and racism and anti-Semitism where we see it, whether it's in person or in our online communities. And I'd like to thank the rest of the team and my co-author, Becca Lewis, for making this report possible, and to Data and Society for a great year. Thank you.